The massive council chamber buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from 47 different alien species had gathered for an emergency meeting. The Xinthian collective had given everyone an ultimatum that could start a war. They wanted control of the mining colonies in the Kepler belt. If they didn't get what they wanted, they would block all trade routes, maybe even start fighting. Kyle Harrison sat quietly in the human section, watching everything with calm eyes. He was 42 years old and had built a reputation as Earth's best negotiator. But he didn't negotiate the way other diplomats did. He studied his opponents like a hunter studies prey. He found their weaknesses and used them. His assistant, Monica Price, leaned over and whispered to him. The Xinthians brought their entire war fleet. They're serious this time. Kyle nodded but kept watching the lead Xinthian negotiator. His name was Thexikar, a huge insect-like creature that towered over most other beings in the room. While everyone else looked worried and whispered frantically to each other, Kyle sat perfectly still. He was waiting for the right moment. The council arbiter called the meeting to order. He was an old Trellin who had solved conflicts for thousands of years. His voice was deep and carried authority. The Xinthian collective has made their demands clear. We will now hear responses and proposals. The room exploded with voices. The Viridian ambassador begged for peace at any price. The Kryn representative shouted about fighting back. The smaller species looked terrified because they knew their worlds would be destroyed first if war started. Kyle waited through 20 minutes of arguing before he pressed his button to speak. His voice cut through all the noise. I would like to speak. The chamber went silent. Humans were new to galactic politics. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 70 years ago. But Kyle Harrison had made a name for himself. Some people thought he was brilliant. Others thought he was dangerous. Ambassador Harrison, the arbiter said. The council recognizes you. Kyle stood up slowly. He looked directly at Thexikar. Something in his eyes made the huge Xinthian shift uncomfortably in his seat. I have reviewed the Xinthian demands. Kyle began in a casual tone. I noticed something interesting. Your collective brought military forces to the neutral zone. Very impressive. Thexikar's insect mandibles clicked with satisfaction. Yes, the collective is completely committed. Without a doubt, Kyle agreed smoothly, which makes me wonder about the timing. Your fleet left your home systems about 40 days ago. That's a big commitment of resources. It also means your primary defenses back home are now running at only 63% strength. The Xinthian ambassador froze. Around the chamber, different species started checking their intelligence data. Kyle was right. Kyle continued, still sounding pleasant, but his eyes were cold. I'm also curious about your farming situation. The disease in your southern farming areas has reduced your food production by 37%. Without the trade routes you're threatening to block, I calculate that your people will start starving in about 6 months. These are internal matters, Thexikar hissed. But now he sounded uncertain. Of course, Kyle smiled, though his eyes stayed cold. I'm sure it's just coincidence that your main competitor, the Vrax Consortium, has been quietly buying up contracts in territories you left undefended when you moved your fleet. Monica watched her boss with mixed feelings of admiration and unease. This was Kyle Harrison's method. He didn't argue about right and wrong. He didn't appeal to anyone's better nature. He took his opponents apart piece by piece, found every weak spot, and pressed until they had no choice but to give in. The arbiter looked concerned. Ambassador Harrison, the council wants peaceful solutions, not threats. So do I, Kyle replied. That's why I'm proposing something different. The Xinthians withdraw their fleet and drop their demands about the Kepler belt. In exchange, humanity will guarantee food shipments at cheap prices for the next year. We'll also send military advisors to help fix your defense problems. This is insulting, Thexikar roared. You offer us charity like we're weak. Kyle's expression didn't change. I offer you survival. Your other choice is to continue this blockade and watch your people starve, while the Vrax Consortium takes your territory. Then you can try to fight on 2 fronts with a weakened military, or you can accept terms that let you rebuild from a position of strength instead of desperation. He leaned forward slightly. His next words were absolutely certain. I didn't come here to negotiate whether you'll back down. I came to negotiate the terms of how you'll do it. The outcome was decided the moment you chose to threaten species under human protection. The chamber held its breath. Kyle Harrison had just done something no other species dared. He treated the Xinthian threat not as a crisis to solve, but as a problem already solved. He made their threatening military position look like a minor inconvenience. Thexkar's eyes darted around the chamber looking for support. He found none. Every species there had just watched a human systematically destroy what should have been an unbeatable position. If Kyle Harrison could do this to the powerful Zynthian collective, what could he do to them? This matter requires discussion with the collective, Thexkar finally said. Everyone could hear the defeat in his voice. Of course, Kyle agreed pleasantly. You have 12 hours. After that, I start discussing defense partnerships with the Vrax Consortium. As the meeting ended, Monica followed Kyle out of the chamber. Sir, you just made a lot of species very nervous about how humans negotiate. Kyle's face stayed neutral. Good, nervous people make fewer mistakes. Besides, the Zynthians were counting on everyone else being too afraid or too polite to call their bluff. Humans didn't evolve with those particular limitations. The other species think we negotiate like predators. We do, Kyle said simply. We're just better at it than most predators they know. Human predators learned long ago that the most effective hunts end without any blood being spilled. The prey simply realizes it's already been caught. As they left, neither of them noticed the small recording device a journalist had left behind. Within hours, Kyle's entire performance would be broadcast across 100 worlds. Beings everywhere would start to understand something disturbing. Humans had brought a completely new approach to galactic diplomacy. They called it negotiation. But it looked remarkably like warfare by other means, and the galaxy would never be quite the same again. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. On planets thousands of light years apart, beings watched recordings of Kyle Harrison's performance. Some admired him. Others were horrified. On the Trellin homeworld, the Council Arbiter met with his advisors in a beautiful crystal chamber. I've solved disputes for 3 centuries, he told his staff. His usually calm voice was shaken. Never have I seen someone tear apart an opponent's position so completely. His chief aide showed him analysis reports. Ambassador Harrison spent 3 weeks before this meeting gathering information on Zynthian weaknesses. He knew their exact fleet positions, their economic problems, even what their competitors were doing. He walked into that chamber already holding every advantage. That level of preparation, another advisor said, means he saw this crisis coming well before we did. He may have been planning this for months. On the human diplomatic station orbiting Earth's moon, Kyle sat in a meeting with Director Patricia Hughes. She ran Earth's office for dealing with alien species. You achieved what we hoped for, Patricia said, looking at reports on her display. The Zynthians accepted your terms. But Kyle, you've also terrified half the galaxy. Fear creates respect. Respect creates stability. It also creates enemies. She gave him a stern look. I'm getting messages from a dozen ambassadors asking if humanity plans to remake galactic politics in our image. Kyle thought about this. Director, when humanity first achieved faster-than-light travel, what did we find? A galaxy full of civilizations older and more advanced than us, Patricia answered, knowing he had a point to make. Exactly. Species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years while we were still figuring out basic engines. They had better technology, more territory, and political connections we couldn't match. He walked to the window overlooking Earth. So we adapted. We used what we're good at, which is strategy, competition, the ability to spot patterns and exploit them. Humans spent our entire evolution as both hunter and prey. We learned to read intentions, predict behavior, and outthink opponents who were often stronger than us. He turned back to face her. These aliens achieved space travel through brilliance in science or engineering. Humanity achieved it through stubbornness and problem-solving, born from constant survival pressure. We're not smarter than them. We're just wired differently. Patricia studied him carefully. The other species see diplomacy as building agreement and finding common ground. You see it as something else. Controlled conflict, Kyle finished. Because that's what it is. Nations, species, groups, they all have competing interests. The question is never whether conflict exists, but how it's managed. Most galactic species try to minimize conflict through compromise. Humans understand that sometimes the best solution is making it clear that continued conflict costs more than cooperation. That's a very military philosophy for a diplomat. Is it? Kyle challenged. Director, how many wars has humanity fought in the last 50 years compared to the previous 50? None, she admitted. Since joining Galactic Society, we've had peace. Because we made it clear that fighting us is a losing proposition. even when we're not fighting. The Xinthians could have pushed their blockade. They chose not to because I made them understand the math-favored surrender. No shots fired. No lives lost. That's not military philosophy. That's effective diplomacy. Monica entered with an urgent message. Sir, we have a situation. The Cavalry Union is requesting immediate human help with their border dispute with the Plaxan Confederacy. They specifically asked for you. Kyle and Patricia looked at each other. That's halfway across the galaxy, Patricia noted. Why would they want human involvement? Monica pulled up the information. The dispute has been going on for 2 years with no solution. Both sides are preparing for war. The Cavalry ambassador watched your session with the Xinthians and thinks human methods might be their only chance to avoid fighting. Or they think they can manipulate a human negotiator who doesn't know their regional politics, Kyle said thoughtfully. That's possible, Monica agreed. We don't know much about that sector. Patricia looked concerned. Kyle, this could be a trap. These are species with centuries of history together. You'd be walking into a situation where you don't have the information advantage you had with the Xinthians. Which is exactly why I should go, Kyle replied. If humanity only gets involved where we already know everything, we'll never gain real credibility. Besides, he smiled slightly, the best way to gather intelligence is often to let the other side think they have the advantage. Patricia sighed, recognizing that look in his eyes. You have authorization for preliminary assessment. But Kyle, if this situation is as complex as it seems, you may need to use more traditional diplomatic approaches. I'll adapt as needed, he assured her. 3 days later, Kyle and Monica boarded the human ship Horizon, heading for the Cavalry Union homeworld. The journey would take 2 weeks even at maximum speed. During the trip, Kyle studied everything available about the Cavalry and Plaxan species. The Cavalry were telepathic beings whose culture valued group harmony and agreement. The Plaxans were logical creatures who organized their entire society around math and resource efficiency. This is going to be interesting, Monica said during one of their planning sessions. Neither species operates on the competitive thinking you usually exploit. Everyone competes, Kyle replied. They just use different frameworks. The Cavalry compete through social position in their telepathic networks. The Plaxans compete through showing superior logical reasoning. The conflict probably comes from completely incompatible value systems trying to exist at the same border. So how do you negotiate with beings who think completely differently from humans? Kyle's smile was sharp. The same way humans have always dealt with different creatures. We find the universal constants like survival, resource security, and legacy. Every intelligent species values these things regardless of their culture. That seems overly simple. Perhaps. But simplicity is useful when complexity causes paralysis. These species spent 2 years trying to find common ground through their cultural perspectives. Maybe what they need is an outside view that cuts through the cultural noise to the underlying interests. Monica wasn't entirely convinced, but she had learned to trust Kyle's instincts. Still, part of her worried about what would happen if his approach failed in such a high-stakes situation. On the Cavalry homeworld, news of the human envoy's arrival created mixed reactions. Some hoped fresh perspective would break the deadlock. Others worried that humanity's aggressive reputation would make tensions worse instead of better. Chancellor Lyris, the Cavalry's chief negotiator, discussed the situation with her advisory circle through their telepathic network. This human, Harrison, has a reputation for forcing opponents to surrender rather than finding mutual benefit. Are we certain this is wise? We've tried everything else, one advisor responded telepathically. Our own approaches failed. Perhaps we need methods that feel uncomfortable to achieve peace. Or perhaps, another voice warned, we're inviting a predator to solve a problem between peaceful species, not realizing that predators have their own agenda. Lyris considered this carefully. Then we must watch closely. Observe this human. Learn how his mind works. If he proves more threat than solution, we can dismiss him. But as the Horizon approached Cavalry space, none of them truly understood what Kyle Harrison's presence would mean. They thought they were hiring a negotiator. What they were really doing was introducing a completely new form of diplomacy to their region of space. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. The Cavalry homeworld was beautiful. Crystal structures hummed with telepathic energy across the entire planet. Kyle and Monica were escorted through the capital city to the negotiation complex. a massive dome where both sides would meet. Their buildings literally resonate with their collective consciousness, Monica observed, noticing how the structures pulsed with faint light. Everything here is designed for telepathic harmony. Which means they're going to hate my approach, Kyle said calmly. Telepathic species value consensus and shared understanding. My methods create division and calculated pressure. Chancellor Lyris greeted them at the entrance. She looked humanoid, but her skin shimmered like pearl. Her eyes held ancient wisdom. Ambassador Harrison, we welcome you. I must admit, your reputation comes with both impressive and concerning aspects. I appreciate your honesty, Chancellor, Kyle replied. I find that concerns expressed openly are easier to address than those left unsaid. Lyris led them inside. The Plaxan delegation arrived yesterday. They're in separate facilities because our peoples can no longer share space without tension rising. Tell me about the core dispute, Kyle requested as they walked. The border region contains a nebula cluster with unique properties, Lyris explained. Our people see it as sacred space, a natural phenomenon that resonates with our telepathic consciousness. The Plaxans see it as resources to be cataloged and efficiently used. For 2 years we've sought compromise. They refuse to recognize spiritual significance. We cannot allow industrialization of holy space. What attempts at resolution have been made? We offered them other resource sites. They refused, saying those alternatives are mathematically inferior. They offered us money and designated spiritual sites elsewhere. We cannot simply move our sacred spaces like replaceable items. Frustration entered her voice. We talked past each other, unable to bridge the gap in worldview. They entered the negotiation chamber. The room had 3 distinct zones. Cavalry on one side, Plaxan on another, and a neutral center for mediators. The Plaxan delegation was led by Coordinator Vexilin. His body appeared partially crystalline computer matrix, partially organic tissue. Their entire species existed as a hybrid of biological and technological systems. Ambassador Harrison, Vexilin's voice was perfectly even, stripped of emotion. We have analyzed your previous negotiations. Your success rate is statistically significant, though your methods rely on information advantage and psychological pressure, rather than logical resolution. That's a fair assessment, Kyle agreed without being bothered. I'm curious, Coordinator. Your calculations suggest the disputed nebula offers 23% greater resource efficiency than alternatives. Is that correct? Precisely 23.74%, yes. And Chancellor Lyris, your people's telepathic connection with the nebula has cultural significance dating back about 8,000 years? Closer to 8,200 years, but yes. Kyle nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to propose something unusual. Rather than beginning with what each side wants, let's start with what each side fears. Both delegations shifted uncomfortably. Lyris spoke first. That's not typical protocol. No, it's not, Kyle agreed. But typical protocol has failed you for 2 years. So humor me. Chancellor, what does the Cavalry Union fear if the Plaxans industrialize the nebula? Lyris considered, then answered honestly. We fear our children will lose connection to our heritage. The nebula isn't just sacred space. It's where our young telepaths go for their awakening ceremonies. If it becomes an industrial zone, we lose not just a location, but a piece of our identity. We fear cultural erosion, the slow death of what makes us cavalry. Kyle turned to the Plaxan coordinator. And what does the Confederacy fear if they don't secure those resources? Vexilin processed the question. Fear is not accurate terminology. However, our projections indicate that without the nebula's resources, our industrial efficiency decreases, which cascades into economic disadvantage. Over 2 centuries, this compounds into potential strategic vulnerability. We require optimal resource acquisition to maintain security. So both sides fear becoming less than what you are, Kyle summarized. The cavalry fear cultural loss. The Plaxans fear strategic loss. The nebula represents survival of identity for one, survival of security for the other. That's an oversimplification, Vexilin stated. Most critical truths are simple, Kyle replied. Now here's what I observe. You're both arguing over territory when what you're really fighting for is survival, and you're both willing to risk war because you frame this as winner-take-all. He pulled up displays showing both species' territories. Chancellor, the Cavalry Union controls 17 other nebula formations of similar composition. Coordinator, The Plaxon Confederacy has identified 43 alternative resource sites within your territory. None match the efficiency of the disputed nebula, Vexlin objected. And none of our other nebulae hold the ceremonial significance of this one, Lyris added. Precisely, Kyle agreed. Which means this conflict isn't actually about resources or spirituality. It's about precedent and pride. Both of you are willing to fight because backing down would signal weakness. The room fell silent. Both delegations radiated discomfort at having their true motivations exposed so bluntly. Kyle continued, his tone harder now. Here's what happens if you go to war. Chancellor, your telepathic networks give you tactical advantages in combat coordination, but the Plaxon's computational processing allows faster strategic adaptation. You'll win initial battles through superior unit cohesion. They'll win the long campaign through superior logistics and resource management. The war will drag on for years, cost millions of lives on both sides, and end in mutual exhaustion. Your projections are speculative, Vexlin noted. My projections are based on 37 historical conflicts between similarly matched species, Kyle countered. I've studied them all. The outcome has a 91% confidence level. You want me to detail exactly how your war will unfold? The threat in his voice was clear. He could and would demonstrate his knowledge was superior to their assumptions. Monica watched her superior work with fascination. This was Kyle Harrison's true skill, not just gathering information but presenting it in ways that made conflict seem both inevitable and pointless. So what do you propose? Lyris asked, frustration evident. We cannot abandon our sacred space. And we cannot accept inferior resource acquisition, Vexlin added. Kyle smiled slightly. Then you change the equation. Make it so both of you benefit more from cooperation than conflict. He pulled up new displays showing economic projections. Coordinator Vexlin, your species excels at system optimization. The Kaveri have 17 nebula formations they don't fully utilize because they lack industrial infrastructure. What if the Confederacy provided that infrastructure in exchange for resource-sharing agreements? Your net resource acquisition increases by 41% across all sites rather than 24% from this one disputed territory. Vexlin's crystalline parts flickered as calculations processed. That would require long-term cooperation agreements. Yes, it would, Kyle agreed. Which brings me to you, Chancellor. What if the disputed nebula became jointly administered sacred and scientific space? The Plaxons conduct research that doesn't interfere with ceremonies, and your people gain access to their scientific discoveries about the nebula's properties. Your understanding of what makes this space sacred deepens through their analysis. Joint administration requires trust we don't have, Lyris countered. Then build it, Kyle said simply. Start with a 10-year trial period. Both sides maintain monitoring stations. Any violations trigger immediate renegotiation with a neutral arbiter. Humanity, if you'll accept us. Your peoples learn to work together on small scales before committing to permanent arrangements. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Here's the reality. You can fight over this nebula and destroy each other slowly, or you can use this dispute as the foundation for a partnership that makes both species stronger. The choice isn't between winning and losing. It's between stagnation and growth. The two delegations looked at each other across the chamber. Centuries of mutual suspicion were evident in their postures. You make it sound simple, Lyris said quietly. It is simple, Kyle replied. It's just not easy. Simple means the path is clear. Easy would mean the path requires no courage. The negotiations continued for 3 more days. Kyle pressed both sides relentlessly, giving neither comfort nor satisfaction. By the end, the agreement reached was not what either side entered wanting, but it was something both could accept. As Kyle prepared to leave, Chancellor Lyris met with him privately. You fight wars without weapons, Ambassador Harrison. I prevent wars, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Is there? You maneuver beings into positions where they have no choice but to comply. That's a form of conquest, Kyle considered her words. Perhaps. But I've never seen a negotiation without pressure and leverage. I just acknowledge what everyone else pretends doesn't exist. Power, advantage, consequence. They're always present. I simply make them visible. Other species will fear this. Some will. Others will seek it out. Regardless, humanity is here now. We're not going to negotiate the way you expect, just to make you comfortable. 6 months after the Cavalry-Plaxon Agreement, galactic politics had changed dramatically. 3 more regional conflicts had requested human help. In each case, Kyle Harrison or one of his trained negotiators had achieved quick results that left both sides reluctantly satisfied and strangely unsettled. But success created enemies. On the Trellin homeworld, the Council Arbiter held a closed meeting with ambassadors from the galaxy's oldest civilizations. The mood was tense. Humanity's diplomatic methods are destroying centuries of established rules, Ambassador Kelvar of the Sindara Collective argued. They treat negotiation as warfare by other means. This cannot continue. The results are undeniable, countered Ambassador Holm of the Vryn Concordat. Wars prevented, resources optimized, conflicts resolved in weeks that would have taken years through traditional means. At what cost? Kelvar demanded. They achieved these results through manipulation, intimidation, and exploitation of weaknesses. This is not diplomacy. This is predation wearing a diplomatic mask. The Arbiter raised a calming hand. I've mediated for 3 centuries. I've seen many approaches. Humanity's methods are aggressive, but they're not without precedent. The Kryn dominated negotiations through military threats for thousands of years. The Tazaran used economic leverage similarly. But the humans combine all approaches, another ambassador said. Military analysis, economic pressure, psychological manipulation, information advantage. They weaponize every aspect of negotiation at once. It's overwhelming. What they didn't know was that Kyle Harrison was listening to their entire discussion. Human intelligence had long since infiltrated galactic communication networks. Kyle made it a priority to know what others said about humanity when they thought no humans were listening. He sat in his office on the lunar station with Monica beside him, monitoring the secret feed. They're scared, she observed, actually frightened of what we represent. Good, Kyle replied, though his expression was thoughtful. Fear means they're taking us seriously. It also means they might unite against us. If the older civilizations decide humanity is a threat to galactic order, we could find ourselves isolated. Possibly, but they won't unify completely. Their interests are too different. He paused the recording and zoomed in on Shelvar's face. The Sindara are concerned because we revealed their resource problems in the Outer Rim. Ambassador Holm is quietly pleased because we exposed Sindara weakness. Every species in that room has different reasons for their positions. So we're exploiting their divisions to prevent unified opposition, Monica said. Exactly the approach they fear from us. Welcome to power politics, Kyle said dryly. The game hasn't changed just because we're playing on a galactic scale. Their conversation was interrupted by Director Patricia Hughes appearing via hologram. Her expression was serious. Kyle, we have a major problem. The Korthan Empire has filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Council, accusing humanity of spying and manipulation. The Korthans? Kyle frowned. We haven't even negotiated with them. That's exactly their complaint. They claim our intelligence gathering is an act of aggression, and your negotiation methods amount to psychological warfare prohibited under galactic rules. Kyle and Monica looked at each other. The Korthan Empire was one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, with military strength that rivaled dozens of smaller species combined. This is political, Kyle assessed immediately. The Korthans are allied with the Sindara. They're using this complaint to establish legal precedent limiting human operations. Correct, Patricia confirmed, and it's working. The Council has scheduled a hearing to examine humanity's diplomatic practices. Kyle, they're going to put you on trial, not literally, but they'll examine every negotiation you've conducted, every method you've used. They're looking for justification to restrict us. When is this hearing? 3 weeks. And Kyle, you'll be expected to defend not just your actions but humanity's entire approach. If the Council rules against us, we could be restricted to observer status in galactic affairs. After Patricia disconnected, Monica looked at her superior with concern. They're trying to neutralize our advantage before we can become too influential. If we're limited to traditional methods, we lose what makes us effective. Kyle stood and walked to the window, staring at Earth below. They're not entirely wrong to be concerned, he admitted quietly. Our methods are aggressive. We do treat diplomacy as controlled conflict. The question is whether that's wrong or simply different. You're actually considering they might have a point? I always consider that possibility, Kyle replied. Certainty is the death of strategy. If I can't question my own assumptions, I'm vulnerable to those who can. Over the following weeks, Kyle prepared for the council hearing with the same careful attention he brought to every negotiation. But this time the stakes were different. He wasn't just representing human interests in a specific dispute. He was defending humanity's right to participate in galactic politics on their own terms. The day of the hearing arrived. The council chamber was packed with representatives from over 60 species, all curious to see how the human envoy would defend practices that had made him both famous and infamous across known space. Kyle entered the chamber alone. Monica had offered to come with him, but he declined. "This isn't about assistance," he told her. "It's about showing confidence." The arbiter opened the proceedings. "Ambassador Harrison, you stand before the council not as a criminal, but as a representative of practices that have generated significant concern. We gather to examine whether humanity's diplomatic methods align with the values and traditions of galactic civilization." Ambassador Kelvar rose to present the case against humanity. For 2 hours, the Sindera representative detailed every instance where Kyle had used psychological pressure, information advantage, and strategic intimidation. The presentation was thorough, professional, and damning. "The evidence is clear," Kelvar concluded. "Humanity approaches diplomacy not as a cooperative effort to find mutual benefit, but as a competitive contest to be won through superior tactics and ruthless exploitation of weakness. This philosophy is incompatible with the collaborative spirit that has maintained galactic peace for thousands of years." The chamber murmured agreement. Kyle watched and listened, his expression neutral, waiting. "Ambassador Harrison," the arbiter said, "you may now respond." Kyle rose and walked to the center. He didn't use any displays or files. He simply stood and spoke. "I've listened carefully to Ambassador Kelvar's concerns, and I want to start by acknowledging something important. He's not wrong about what humanity does. Our methods are aggressive. We do seek advantages. We do pressure opponents into accepting terms they might not choose freely. All of this is accurate." The admission surprised everyone. Most had expected defensive arguments. Kyle continued, "But I reject entirely the premise that this makes us unsuitable for galactic diplomacy. In fact, I would argue the opposite. Our methods are more honest than the system we're being asked to follow." "Honest?" Kelvar said incredulously. "You call manipulation honest?" "Yes," Kyle replied firmly. "Because we acknowledge what everyone in this chamber pretends doesn't exist. Power, competition, self-interest. These are fundamental realities of intelligent civilization. Yet galactic diplomacy operates on a fiction that they can be overcome through politeness and procedure." He turned to address the entire assembly. "Every species here pursues their own interests. Every negotiation involves implicit threats and promises. Every agreement is based on calculations of advantage. The only difference is that humanity acknowledges this openly." "You reduce diplomacy to mere calculation," another ambassador protested. "No," Kyle countered. "I reduce it to honest calculation. Let me ask this chamber a question. In the last century, how many disputes were resolved through traditional methods only to resurface years later because the underlying tensions were never truly addressed?" The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew the answer. Traditional galactic diplomacy excels at creating the appearance of resolution while leaving core conflicts unaddressed, Kyle pressed. "You cover over problems with polite language and procedural compromises. Then you congratulate yourselves on maintaining peace while the same disputes simmer and eventually explode. And your method is superior?" Kelvar challenged. "My method forces parties to confront reality," Kyle replied. "Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it involves pressure and leverage, but it produces agreements based on clear assessment of interests and consequences, not wishful thinking about cooperation that doesn't actually exist." He gestured around the chamber. "Look at the results. The Xinthian collective accepted terms that genuinely addressed their food security. The Cavalry and Plaxons built a partnership that neither expected but both benefit from. These aren't temporary patches. They're sustainable solutions because all parties understand exactly why cooperation serves them better than conflict." The arbiter leaned forward. "Yet your methods generate fear and resentment. Many species are uncomfortable with humanity's approach. Because I make visible the power dynamics they prefer to keep invisible," Kyle said bluntly. "The older civilizations have maintained stability through a system where everyone pretends power doesn't matter. while quietly exercising it through. After hours of debate and questioning, the council arbiter finally called for a formal decision. The chamber fell silent as he prepared to announce the ruling. The council has considered all evidence and arguments presented. While concerns about humanity's diplomatic methods are noted and not without merit, the council finds no basis to restrict human participation in galactic negotiations. He paused, his voice becoming firmer. However, humanity is reminded that diplomatic immunity does not exempt one from ethical conduct. Future complaints will be examined with heightened scrutiny. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough. Humanity could continue practicing diplomacy on their own terms, at least for now. As Kyle left the chamber, Monica met him outside. That was either brilliant or insane. I'm not sure which. Probably both, Kyle agreed, allowing himself a slight smile. But we needed to establish that humanity won't be forced into molds designed by species with different histories and contexts. If we're going to participate in galactic politics, it has to be as ourselves, not as poor imitations of aliens. You made a lot of enemies today, and a few unexpected allies, Kyle noted, thinking of the species who had defended humanity during the debates. The galaxy's political landscape is shifting. Humanity is part of that shift now. What neither of them knew was that this hearing had established something far more significant than just humanity's diplomatic standing. Kyle Harrison had articulated a philosophy that would inspire a generation of negotiators, both human and alien, to rethink fundamental assumptions about conflict resolution. 2 years passed. The galactic diplomatic landscape had transformed in ways even Kyle hadn't fully anticipated. His methods had not only been accepted but adopted, adapted, and sometimes distorted by species across known space. The Vryn Concordat now employed strategic negotiators trained in human-style information warfare. The Balthor Federation had reorganized their entire diplomatic system around principles of leverage and calculated pressure. Even species that initially opposed humanity's approach had quietly begun using elements of strategic transparency in their own practices. But with influence came complications. Thor sat in his office reviewing reports when Monica entered with disturbing news. Sir, we have a serious problem. The Drake and Unity employed a negotiator named Kara Phillips to handle their territorial dispute with the Hectaran Dominion. She's human. I'm aware, Kyle replied carefully. Phillips was one of our diplomatic trainees 3 years ago. She resigned to pursue independent contracts. Well, her independent contract just resulted in the Hectaran ambassador killing himself after being systematically psychologically broken down during negotiations. The Draken got everything they wanted, and now species across the galaxy are pointing to this as proof that human methods are fundamentally destructive. Kyle's expression darkened. This was the nightmare scenario he had worried about. Phillips was talented but lacked ethical grounding. She understood the techniques but not the philosophy behind them. The galaxy doesn't care about that distinction, Monica said bluntly. They see a human negotiator who drove someone to death through psychological warfare. Every argument our opponents made is being proven right. Director Patricia Hughes joined them via hologram, her face grave. Kyle, the council is demanding an emergency session. Multiple species are calling for immediate restrictions on human operations. Some are even suggesting sanctions. How bad is it? Bad enough that I'm being pressured to remove you from active negotiations until this is resolved. There's talk of revoking humanity's diplomatic credentials entirely. Kyle stood and paced, his mind working through scenarios. The Kara Phillips situation is tragic, but it's also revealing. It shows the difference between strategic negotiation and cruelty. We need to make that distinction clear. How? Patricia challenged. You can't reject her methods without undermining your own. The techniques she used came from your teaching. The techniques, yes. The application, no. Kyle turned to face the hologram. Director, I need you to schedule that emergency council session immediately. And I need Kara Phillips to be present. Monica looked shocked. You want to confront her publicly? I want to demonstrate publicly the difference between what I do and what she did, Kyle corrected. If humanity is going to maintain credibility, we need to show that our methods, properly used, prevent suffering rather than cause it. 1 week later, Kyle stood before the Galactic Council again. The chamber was even more crowded than before. This time the mood was hostile. Kara Phillips sat in a separate area, looking defiant despite the scrutiny. She was younger than Kyle, perhaps 30 years old with sharp features and eyes that held no regret. The arbiter opened with unprecedented bluntness. Ambassador Harrison, another human negotiator, has caused a death through diplomatic means. This council demands explanation and accountability. Before Kyle could respond, Ambassador Kelvar stood. I told this council 2 years ago that humanity's methods were dangerous. Now we have proof. A sentient being is dead because humans treat negotiation as psychological warfare. The Hectaran ambassador was weak, Kara Phillips said coldly. If he couldn't withstand basic pressure, that's not my failure. That's his. The chamber erupted in outrage. Kyle remained silent, watching carefully. Kelvar turned on Phillips. Basic pressure? You spent 4 weeks systematically dismantling his confidence, exploiting his personal fears, and cornering him into a position where he saw death as preferable to facing his people with the agreement you forced him to sign. I achieved my client's objectives, Phillips replied without emotion. Isn't that the measure of successful negotiation? No. Kyle's voice cut through the chaos, quiet but commanding. That is precisely not the measure of successful negotiation. All eyes turned to him. Phillips looked at her former instructor with something between curiosity and contempt. Kyle walked to the center of the chamber. I taught Kara Phillips the techniques she used in that negotiation. I'm responsible for her training, but I failed to adequately convey the principles that should govern the use of those techniques. You're admitting responsibility? The arbiter asked, surprised. I'm admitting incomplete instruction, Kyle clarified. And I'm here to complete that instruction now, publicly, so there can be no future confusion about what humanity's diplomatic philosophy actually represents. He turned to address Phillips directly. You're right that I taught you how to identify psychological vulnerabilities, how to apply pressure, how to leverage information advantages. What I failed to emphasize is why we do these things and what limits must govern their use. Limits are weakness, Phillips stated flatly. You said yourself that negotiation is controlled conflict. In conflict, you use every advantage to win. I said negotiation is controlled conflict, Kyle agreed. You forgot the critical word, controlled. The control isn't just tactical. It's ethical. He displayed recordings of his past negotiations. Look at my resolution of the Xinthian crisis. Yes, I applied pressure, but the outcome left them stronger, not weaker. Their food security was addressed. Their strategic position improved. I forced them to accept terms, but the terms were designed for their long-term benefit. Another display showed the Kaveri-Plaxon agreement. Here I pushed both sides past their comfort zones. But the result was a partnership that made both species more secure. The pressure I applied was in service of their mutual survival, not their destruction. Kyle's gaze hardened as he looked at Phillips. You broke someone. I build sustainable solutions. That's not a trivial distinction. That's the entire difference between diplomacy and sadism. Sentimentality, Phillips scoffed. You're just better at hiding the cruelty behind noble justifications. Am I? Kyle challenged. Then explain why none of my negotiations resulted in deaths, while yours killed someone in your first major contract. Explain why species that negotiated with me request human help again, while the Draken Unity is now facing economic sanctions because of how you represented them. He turned back to the council. Strategic diplomacy isn't about breaking opponents. It's about making visible the costs of continued conflict and the benefits of resolution. Yes, that involves pressure. Yes, it involves leveraging advantages. But it must always be directed toward outcomes that all parties can sustain. This is what humanity brings to galactic diplomacy. The recognition that conflict is natural, that power matters, that interest must be acknowledged. But we also bring the understanding, hard-won through our own bloody history, that victory through destruction is no victory at all. Humans learned painfully that the defeated enemy of today becomes the threat of tomorrow. Sustainable peace requires that all parties maintain dignity and stake in the outcome. Ambassador Kelvar spoke, his tone less hostile now. You're saying Phillips violated these principles. I'm saying she never understood them, Kyle replied. She learned techniques without philosophy, methods without ethics, and the result was predictable tragedy. He faced Phillips again. You thought ruthlessness was strength? You're wrong. True strength in negotiation is creating outcomes where even the losing party recognizes they've been treated fairly, where pressure is applied only to prevent greater harm, where victory means everyone survives to negotiate another day. That's weakness dressed as wisdom. The Arbiter continued speaking. Additionally, the Council recognizes that humanity's diplomatic philosophy, properly applied, has produced beneficial outcomes. The tragic incident with negotiator Phillips should not overshadow the legitimate contributions human strategic thinking has made to conflict resolution. However, this incident demonstrates that new diplomatic methods require new safeguards. It was a balanced response, neither complete approval nor condemnation, but it established humanity's right to continue their approach while acknowledging the need for ethical constraints. As Kyle left the chamber, Monica caught up with him. You could have thrown Phillips to the wolves and protected yourself. Instead, you took responsibility and offered restrictions on all of humanity's diplomatic operations. Why? Kyle considered the question. Because she was right that I taught her those techniques. And because if we want the galaxy to trust human methods, we need to demonstrate that we understand the dangers as well as the advantages. Power without accountability is tyranny, whether exercised through weapons or words. The other human negotiators aren't going to be happy about the new oversight requirements. No, Kyle agreed, but they'll accept them because the alternative is losing the right to practice strategic diplomacy entirely. Sometimes the best victory is the one that leaves you still in the game. In the following years, human diplomatic training changed dramatically. Ethical preparation was incorporated extensively alongside tactical instruction. The tragic Phillips incident became a required case study in every curriculum, a reminder that methods without principles were just another form of violence. But the broader impact of humanity's diplomatic philosophy continued to reshape galactic politics. Other species adapted strategic transparency to their own cultures. The ancient system of polite fiction gradually gave way to more direct acknowledgement of interests and power dynamics. Wars were prevented not through wishful thinking about cooperation, but through clear assessment of consequences. Kyle Harrison eventually retired from active diplomatic service, though his influence continued through the hundreds of negotiators he had trained and the philosophical shift he had sparked. In his final address to Earth's diplomatic team, he offered a summary of his career. We came to the galactic community as a young species, lacking the technological advantages or territorial holdings of established civilizations, so we used what we had: strategic thinking, competitive drive, and the willingness to make visible what others preferred to keep hidden. We showed the galaxy that power acknowledged could be power controlled, that conflicts addressed directly could be conflicts genuinely resolved. He paused, looking at the assembled diplomats, but we also learned, sometimes painfully, that our methods carried risks. The techniques divorced from ethics became weapons, that winning negotiations meant nothing if the defeated became future enemies. We learned to balance our competitive nature with responsibility for the outcomes we created. That's humanity's gift to galactic diplomacy, not just strategic thinking, but strategic thinking tempered by hard-won wisdom. We negotiate like predators, yes, but we're predators who learned that the best hunt is the one where your prey survives to be your partner tomorrow. That's not weakness, that's evolution, and it's what will ensure humanity's influence continues long after any individual negotiator is forgotten. Kyle stepped down from the podium to sustained applause. Monica, who had been promoted to deputy director, met him afterward. That was a good speech, though I'm surprised you didn't mention your greatest achievement, which is, you changed how an entire galaxy thinks about conflict. That's more than any single negotiation could accomplish. Kyle smiled slightly. Maybe, but I prefer to think of it differently. I didn't change the galaxy. I just helped it see what was already there. Conflict, competition, the struggle for advantage. These things existed long before humans arrived. We just stopped pretending they didn't. And in doing so, you made peace more achievable. Perhaps, or perhaps we just made the path to peace more honest. Time will tell which matters more. Decades later, scholars studying galactic diplomatic history identified the Kyle Harrison era as a fundamental turning point. Before Harrison, diplomacy operated on unspoken assumptions about cooperation and shared values. After Harrison, it operated on explicit acknowledgement of interests, power, and consequence. Some called it the humanization of galactic politics. Others called it the necessary maturation of diplomatic practice. Regardless of terminology, the change was undeniable. The Council Arbiter, now centuries old, reflected on the transformation in his final interview before retirement. When Ambassador Harrison first appeared before the council, I thought he represented a dangerous deviation from established norms. I was both right and wrong. He was dangerous to the old order, yes, but that order had grown complacent, more concerned with maintaining comfortable fictions than addressing actual conflicts. Harrison forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. That every negotiation involves power, that every agreement is based on calculated advantage, that sustainable peace requires honest acknowledgement of interests rather than polite pretense of universal harmony. These truths were always present, but we had built elaborate systems to avoid confronting them. The human approach stripped away those comfortable layers. It was jarring, sometimes frightening, but ultimately, it made us better at what we claimed to be doing. We stopped papering over problems and started actually solving them. Wars that would have simmered for decades were resolved in months. Conflicts that traditional methods couldn't address found solutions through strategic transparency. Did humanity's methods come with costs? Certainly. The Phillips incident proved that powerful techniques require ethical constraints. But those constraints were established because humans themselves recognized the danger. That's the real lesson of the Harrison era. Not that ruthlessness succeeds, but that strategic thinking combined with ethical responsibility creates sustainable outcomes. On Earth, in a quiet retirement community overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Kyle Harrison spent his final years gardening and occasionally advising young diplomats who sought his counsel. He had declined numerous offers to write memoirs or give extensive interviews, preferring to let his work speak for itself. One afternoon, a young human negotiator named Lisa Brooks visited him. She was preparing for her first major interstellar assignment and wanted advice. "Everyone says I should study your techniques," she told him as they sat on his porch watching the sunset. "But the more I learn about your career, the more I realize the techniques are just tools. What I really need to understand is the thinking behind them." Kyle nodded approvingly. "You're wiser than I was at your age. It took me years to fully understand that myself. The techniques are important, yes, but without the right principles guiding their use, they're just weapons. So what principles should guide me?" Kyle thought carefully before answering. "First, remember that every negotiation involves real beings with real needs and fears. Your goal isn't to crush them, but to find solutions they can live with. Second, acknowledge power openly, but use it judiciously. The point of making power visible isn't to intimidate, but to create clear understanding of consequences. Third, always ask yourself whether the outcome you're pursuing serves long-term stability or just short-term victory. And fourth," he added with a slight smile, "remember that being human means we're naturally competitive and strategic. Don't apologize for that, but also don't forget that being human means we're capable of learning from our mistakes and choosing cooperation over domination when cooperation serves everyone better." Lisa absorbed this thoughtfully. "You know, when other species talk about human negotiation methods, they still use the phrase negotiate like a predator, but I don't think they mean it as an insult anymore." "No," Kyle agreed. "Because we taught them that being a predator doesn't mean being destructive. Predators can choose their prey carefully. They can hunt with precision rather than waste. They can recognize when cooperation serves them better than conflict. That's what makes humans effective negotiators. Not that we're ruthless, but that we're strategic enough to know when ruthlessness serves our interests and when it doesn't. And usually," he added, "it doesn't. Because the galaxy is too interconnected now for zero-sum thinking to work. Every species depends on others for resources, security, knowledge. The human contribution wasn't teaching everyone to be more aggressive. It was teaching everyone to be more honest about their aggressiveness, so it could be channeled productively." Lisa stood to leave as the sun touched the horizon. "Thank you, Ambassador. I think I understand now what I need to do." "Just remember," Kyle said as she departed, "the goal isn't to be remembered as the diplomat who won every negotiation. It's to be the diplomat who left the galaxy more stable than you found it. Everything else is ego." Kyle Harrison passed away peacefully 2 years later at the age of 94. His funeral was attended by representatives from over 100 species, including former opponents who had initially despised his methods, but came to respect what he had achieved. The Arbiter, himself near the end of his long life, gave the eulogy. "Kyle Harrison changed the galaxy not through conquest or domination, but